Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second Ideas lecture featuring innovation and discovery in the Division of Engineering and Applied Science at Caltech. My name is Beverly McKeon, and I am the Deputy Chair of the Division of Engineering and Applied Science and a faculty member in the Aerospace Department. The purpose of our Ideas lecture series is to highlight the engineers and scientists at Caltech whose research focuses on fundamental discoveries, innovations, and inventions that can power the transformative technologies of the future that will create knowledge for the ages and benefit society. In this vein, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Julia Greer. Julia is the Ruben F. and Donna Mettler Professor of Material Science, Mechanics, and Medical Engineering, and the Director of the Kavli Nanoscience Institute at Caltech. Her research focuses on creating and characterizing classes of materials with multi-scale microstructural hierarchy, which combine three-dimensional architectures with nanoscale induced material properties. Julia has more than 150 publications and has delivered over 100 invited lectures, including 2 TEDx talks, multiple plenary lectures, the Watson Lecture at Caltech, the Gilbreth Lecture at the National Academy of Engineering, and the Ideas Lab at the World Economic Forum. Her work was recognized among top 10 breakthrough technologies by MIT's Technology Review. She's been named a CNN 2020 Visionary, one of the 100 most creative people by Fast Company, and named as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, among many other career awards. She is also known as the rollerblading, piano concerto playing material science professor. I'm pleased at this time to introduce Rebecca Gallivan, a PhD candidate in material science at Caltech working under Professor Greer to study 3D printed nanomaterials and how processing affect their mechanical properties. She will moderate the Q&A session at the end of the talk. I now invite Julia Greer to present her Ideas lecture on how do you like your materials with multifunctionality and reconfigurability or just lightweight? Additive manufacturing of 3D architected materials. Julia.
Thank you so much, Beverly. And I really appreciate this introduction, especially the bit about the rollerblading, which of course is true. I'm honored and delighted to deliver this lecture today. And as you've been staring at this title for a little while now, how do you like your materials? So you are all welcome to grab a beverage of your choice and enjoy. I will try to entertain you. And speaking of beverages, do you remember how maybe 20 years ago, the options for one of our favorite beverages, of course, coffee here, were basically coffee or no coffee. So at this point, you fall asleep. Now, maybe 10 years ago, our options became much broader in the sense that they were categorized by color. So either black or white. And today, the coffee options are fully designed. In fact, if you don't order some kind of a half calf, half decaf soy milk cappuccino with goat milk, you really don't know what you were doing. Now, truth be told, I don't know very much about coffee, but I do know quite a bit about materials. And so here I'd like to walk you through the similar evolution of how we can create materials that are fully designed. So less is actually more. When we look at the largest man-made stone structure, this is the Great Pyramid of Giza, what you see here is that it stands about 150 meters tall and it weighs nearly 6 million tons. In contrast to a structure that is fully architected and designed, which stands twice as tall, about 300 meters, and of course weighs 3 orders of magnitude less, so only about 10,000 tons. So this is the kind of concept that we incorporate into creating our materials. So what you're looking at here is the world's most normal dandelion, and what's sitting on top of it is a nickel microlattice. And in fact, since I'm doing this in my office, I can show you this, I don't know if you can see it, but this lightest material is sitting in my hand right here. And if I were to drop it, it will fall down slower than a feather because it's so lightweight. Now, when you architect materials, it's very important that you recognize the building blocks and the dimensions of the building blocks that you need to elicit particular properties. Here, we create these materials using nanometer-sized building blocks. All of these images that you're seeing in front of you right now were created by the current or former students in my group. And of course, the obvious part that you can see from these images is that they're all cellular solids. And so they're very, very porous. Now, the second less obvious level of porosity comes from the fact that these are interwoven three-dimensional networks of hollow components. In this case, it's a tube. And if you zoom in closely into the wall thickness of this tube, you'll recognize that it's hollow. And the wall thickness is on the order of 5 nanometers or so. So these materials embody every length scale from some nanometers to hundreds of nanometers to microns and many hundreds of microns and millimeters and eventually, hopefully soon, centimeters and meters. Now, because of the nanometer-sized building blocks, these materials are no longer properly described just from the materials perspective or from the structural perspective. And so it's appropriate to call these metamaterials in the sense that they don't really exist in nature. Now, those of you who like Doctor Who, here's a micro TARDIS that's roughly the size, about 1,000th of your hair diameter. And so that showcases that we don't have to make these in periodic configurations. Now, there's a reason why we decided to work with the nanoscale. If you look at some common metals like gold, silver, copper in their single crystalline form, and then you plot their strength as a function of their size, what emerges is the so-called size effect, where smaller is stronger. What I mean by that is that this is a log space, and this linear slope actually represents a power law. And that is, if you take your earring, which is very malleable, and reduce its dimensions to about 200 nanometers, it becomes as strong as steel. Now take exactly the same metals, your gold, your copper, your nickel, and deposit it using a different technology. For example, in thin film processing, it's very common to use sputtering as a deposition technique. And now, all of a sudden, this effect is reversed. Smaller is now weaker. This is a more modest size effect. It's not in the log-log plot. Nevertheless, you can use size, external dimensions, as a way to control mechanical strength. Now, the size effect is actually more powerful than that. So here, I'm showing you a glass rod. This particular glass is a special kind of glass that's made entirely of metals. And its dimensions are on the order of 150 nanometers in diameter. And as we're pulling on the glass rod, we all know what happens, right? We know that glass is supposed to shatter. Now, if you zoom into this particular region of this movie, you'll see that what this glass is doing is that it's necking. This is something that is supposed to happen in a ductile metal, like in a metal wire, certainly not in a glass. And you can see how much you can deform it before it breaks. Now, to show you the deformation of a single unit within one of the nano architectures that I showed you, this is made entirely over very, very brittle ceramic, titanium nitride. And you can see that these beams are bending. Now, if you were to calculate the stress that's operating in these beams, it exceeds 1.5 gigapascals. No ceramic is supposed to stay intact when you're applying that much tensile stress to it. This one is not only staying intact, but it's doing it over multiple cycles. So the takeaway message here is this: sometimes materials get stronger. Some other times they get weaker. Another configuration would be the suppression of brittle failure. But all of these effects emerge only at the nanoscale. So the question is, can we somehow harness these beneficial effects and then proliferate them onto the larger scales? And this is where the concept of micro and nano architecting comes into play. We use this technique called two-photon lithography, where it's possible to focus the laser light in a single voxel, and you can see how small it is. And that allows us to sculpt by rastering this voxel in the three-dimensional space to write whatever image you want. We're not limited to periodicity, and there's no mask that's used in this process. In fact, if I could see all of you, I could write a nano version of each one of you. Now, this reaction that creates these scaffolds is all done using the laser light photoinitiatable polymerization. So these are polymers. Now, of course, we're not going to only work with polymers, right? We're a truly material science lab. So one way to create different materials is to coat these scaffolds with the material we're interested in. So this particular deposition process is called atomic layer deposition, or ALD. And all of my colleagues in the ALD community say, oh yeah, we can deposit whatever you want as long as it's alumina. So here's alumina being deposited onto one of our scaffolds. Now, the form factors in which our samples usually come could be cubic. And so when we expose 2 out of the 6 faces on the cubic geometry, we're able to hollow out these structures, and so they effectively look like the Easter Bunny chocolates. So they're made entirely of the material that we deposited, which of course could have nanometer thickness. Here's a real-time video of this process called 2-photon lithography, and the instrument that's patterning it is called the Nanoscribe. So you can see the pattern developing with light in real time. So it's quite observable. Now, everything that we make in our group is either micro or nano sized. So you can't really see it using optical techniques. So we designed and developed and built our own instrument that's comprised of a variety of different modules. So this here is called a scanning electron microscope, which allows us to observe all the structures that we make. We also have an electrochemical measurement capability, as well as the nanomechanical deformation capability and the ability to perform experiments at different temperatures. Now, these are the so-called different inquisition devices, and you can see that we can really push and pull on some very, very small things and deform them in a variety of different ways and learn something from that. Now, here's the big question. Can we take a bunch of nano-sized building blocks, construct them into a macro scale material, and then somehow benefit from the size effect? So what you're looking at is an alumina octet nano architecture, and we're going to compress it. Now imagine your coffee mug with a severe case of osteoporosis. It's very, very porous and very, very brittle. Now let's see what happens. So we would, I should mention that the wall thickness in these beams here is about 50 nanometers. So it's very small, right? 50 billions of a meter. So we are loading it. And of course, just as expected, you see that this particular nanolattice collapses and it's completely dead. We have a little nano cemetery in our instrument. And that's basically the end of that. It crushes and dies. Now, let's repeat this experiment on exactly the same geometry, exactly the same material. And the only thing we're doing differently is that we're reducing the wall thickness by a factor of 5. So instead of 50 nanometers, it's now going to be 10 nanometers. And remember, it's very, very brittle. So here we are, we're compressing it. And this is the work of my former student, Lucas Meza, who is a professor at the University of Washington now. Now you see, we're compressing and we're expecting it to fracture and to crush and die just like the other one did. But wait a minute. This ceramic thinks that it's a sponge. So if this doesn't convince you that there is in fact a size effect, I should just stop my lecture early. So of course this fully recovers. Now, since that time, we have learned quite a bit about the resilience of these materials. What I'm showing you here is the comparison of a periodic versus a bicontinuous nano-labyrinthine type of a architecture, which no longer has the beams associated with it, but now rather it has curved surfaces. And what you are seeing is that both very, very brittle materials are deforming over many, many cycles without any damage. What we've also learned is that these materials don't have to have homogeneous density. For example, when we're compressing something that has 2 distinct density regimes, this bottom part, which of course is more porous, so has a lower load-bearing capability, is fully compressing first and densifies first before the top part even knows that it's being compressed. So this allows us to pre-build the different trajectories of deformation and to elicit the specific response that we want. Here's a very complex material. So this one is fractal in the sense that each beam is now comprised of self-similar unit cells. And when we're compressing a part of this unit cell, you can see the kinking at the lowest degree of hierarchy. And we're expecting it to crush and to really snap and break right at these points. And it fully recovers. So this nano-sized induced behavior that's proliferated onto the larger scale really exists under complex stress states and in complex configurations. Now, when you look at all of the geometries that I showed you here, many of them contain the so-called junctions. So what I mean by that is when multiple beams come together at a node. Now, these nodes are actually not desirable because they accumulate a small amount of damage. So what do? Well, we design an architecture that doesn't have any nodes. What you're looking at here are the interwoven nanolattices where each individual effective beam is not really a beam, but it's effectively a rope. So think of your hammock. Now, of course, this is all very small, so you can see that each individual strand is below a micron in diameter. Now let's see what happens here. This particular architecture, we're pulling on it, so everybody knows that it's okay to pull on a rope, and this one seems to be an elastic rope, so kind of like your rubber band. So let's see what happens when we let go of this tensile stress, and now we start to compress it. Exactly the same sample. And look at this. My good friend a long time ago said, don't ever push on a rope. Well, if it's a nano-architected rope, it's okay. Looks like we're getting the resistance in both directions. So these nano-architected materials allow you to really prescribe and program the type of mechanical response that you may want. Now, here's a question. If we were to build a building that had the same relative dimensions and were made out of the same materials, I'm sure there's a building like that in Singapore somewhere, and if a giant were to come and step on it, would the building spring back? Hopefully some of you are smiling in disbelief because of course this would never happen. So the reason why it only happens at the nanoscale is because of our ability to make materials much closer to ideal. So when you have a thin material, which is only say 10 nanometers thick, and then you architect it into the dimensions, into the size of this building, its properties and its quality is much, much better than the same volume occupied by thicker materials. And it has everything to do with the presence and the density of the flaws, things like microvoids, things like defects, and things like stress concentrations, which is where failure would initiate. So defects are very, very important in materials. So let's look at how the defects would affect the deformation and properties of these architected materials. What I'm showing you here is a carbon nanopillar. Now, we're all familiar with carbon materials. They are not exactly deformable, right? Think of graphite in your pencil. So we're starting to compress this individual micropillar. Actually, I called it a nanopillar, but this guy is a giant. It's 2 microns in diameter. So we're compressing it, and you can probably already tell he's really not enjoying himself very much. He does not like to be compressed. Look at the stress level here. So these are gigapascals, right? So again, billion of pascals, very, very high stress. And we're really crushing this carbon, and it's just not giving up. And in fact, this particular carbon nanopillar thinks of itself as rubber as it fully recovers. Now, when we look inside at the atomic level, look at the scale bar here. So this is on the order of nanometers and angstroms. We learn that there are small fragments of graphene like sp2 hybridized carbon that allow for these local shear transformation events. And in fact, when we collaborate with our computational colleagues at Tsinghua University, it's possible to model this system and then to fully understand why this carbon thinks of itself as rubber. So it's these local transformations that allow the global strain and stress to be accommodated without failure. So it allows it to deform. Well, that's great, right? So now we have these nano-sized building blocks that are actually carbon, but they're rubber-like carbon. So why not make some nanolattices out of them? And guess what? No matter how many times we tried different relative densities, we tried different dimensions, we can get them to be very, very stiff. We can get them to be very, very strong. But every time they catastrophically fail and shatter. So nano-architecting doesn't work for every kind of material, and it's very important that you understand the role of defects and the role of architecture on the material response. Now, our big question was, can we get into the so-called white space? And what I mean by that is that if you plot some kind of a mechanical attribute as a function of the density of the material, everything that we know how to make today is represented by these colorful domains. Now, these oblong shaded regions are all of our data that we've collected over the years. And what you can see is that, for example, making fractal architectures allows us to gain, or rather lose, 2 more orders of magnitude in density. And so this is the so-called white space, an untapped territory where materials have never been before. So we're not where we want to be. We would like to be close to theoretical maximum, of course, but this clearly shows that the combination of the nano-sized building blocks and the architectural approach to material creation provide a pathway to get into that white space. Now, it looks like we did better with the carbon, and in the higher density regime, the carbon nano-architected materials are in fact approaching this theoretical limit. So there's quite a bit of promise in these types of materials. Now, when you work at Caltech, and I am very lucky to have an amazing research group here, there are these brilliant graduate students that tend to push everything. And one of my former graduate students, Andrei Vatke, who got his PhD in 2020 in medical engineering, decided, well, we don't really need to buy these photo-initiatable commercial products. We can just make them ourselves. And while we're at it, why don't we just design the synthetic chemistry route such that we can make other materials, for example, metals. What you see here is a nickel ion that's trapped inside of an organic shell. And as long as we have enough of an acrylic type cross-linking capability within our chemical cocktail, so to speak, we should be able to write these architectures using these metal containing resins. Well, sure enough, so what you see here is the top row are these nickel containing resin architectures, and look at the size of the unit cell here. So this is on the order of 10 microns. Now, using this process called pyrolysis, which is a fancy term for burning in the absence of oxygen, Andrei was able to volatilize all this organic content and to be left with a fully nickel nano-architected materials whose dimensions are much, much smaller. So this process of pyrolysis certainly reduces the dimensions and shrinks everything that we make. You can see, for example, the beam diameter here is on the order of 400 nanometers, and the overall unit cell shrunk from 10 microns down to 2 microns. Now, the question, of course, is, well, how nickel is this nickel? So we performed a full suite of chemical and microstructural characterization. What I'm showing you here are transmission electron microscope images that show exactly what is present in this material. And it looks like it's pretty much all nickel with a little bit of nickel carbide and nickel oxide that most likely formed after this process. So it looks like we're able to make metals, very, very small nano-architected metals, just by simply using chemical synthesis. Well, let's look at the strength of this material. Now, I'd like to point out, this is a very, very low quality material. It's nanocrystalline, it's nanoporous, it probably contains some defects, many, many defects. And here we are doing our nanomechanical characterization. We're compressing it. We're looking at the stress, and the stress is in megapascals. This is pretty good. It's a really porous material. So let's see how it fares compared to other metals. So at that time, we plotted here the specific strength of many, many different metals. So what I mean by specific strength is the strength normalized by density, so that we can compare across multiple different metals. And we're plotting this as a function of their dimensions. So what you can see is that the additive manufacturing routes that exist today, the strength drops off dramatically as you reduce the dimensions by simply a factor of 10. So when you go from 1 millimeter features to 100 micron feature, you can see that they lose about 2 orders of magnitude, actually more, in their strength. So what we would like to point out is that the very, very low quality nickel material that we're presenting here, that's nanocrystalline and nanoporous, fares so well that its strength, we had to break the plot. So its strength is equivalent to something that would have the dimensions of about 0.5 millimeter. So it turns out that the nanoscale is actually quite forgiving against defects, and you don't have to sacrifice your mechanical resilience. Now, using the same approach as in building in extra acrylate chemistry into the photo-initiatable synthesis, Andrei also was able to produce titania. So this is titanium oxide, micro and nano architectures. What you're seeing here is a micro architecture of titania specifically for its photocatalytic properties. And so what these materials are able to do is deactivate microorganisms. For example, this is methylene blue, so it's effectively an E. coli containing solution. And you can see that there is a titanium microarchitecture present in these, but not in the ones on the right. And you can very clearly see how capable it is at deactivating these microorganisms. Now, when you reduce the dimensions of the same material, still titania, it's possible to reduce their dimensions so much so that they become applicable to optics. For example, for nanophotonic applications. And what we're showing you here is the work, again, of Andre and also another former PhD student, Ryan Ng, who got his PhD in chemical engineering also in the same year, just last year. You can see a wood pile architecture here with a periodicity of about 1.5 microns. Well, titania has a band gap that emerges in the infrared. And so what we're showing you here is the band diagram that was both computed and measured using the Fourier transform infrared detector here. And it shows the emergence of a band gap that's shifting. The wavelength is shifting with the periodicity of this wood pile architecture. So it is possible, it's paving a way to create nanophotonic crystals using this type of additive manufacturing and chemical synthesis approach. Now, the acrylate-based chemistry is not exactly the greenest way to produce materials. And so another former student, Dr. Daryl Yee, who got his PhD in material science just last year, developed a hydrogel-based method to produce very functional materials, multifunctional materials. So now there's no more acrylic chemistry, and now this is all based on hydrogels, so effectively it's water. And if you dilute metal salts into this water, and then of course add a few more photoinitiatable and cross-linking chemistries into the cocktail, it's possible to not only 3D sculpt these architectures, but then to subject them to no longer pyrolysis because these are oxides, but to a process called calcination, which is effectively thermal treatment, to create them out of even more exotic materials. For example, zinc oxide has piezoelectric properties. So what you're looking at here is a single unit cell of a zinc oxide nanoarchitecture here. And this top part represents the resin, the zinc oxide containing resin, so not pure zinc oxide yet. And when we measure the voltage response, nothing happens. But after this calcination step, when we only have the zinc oxide containing architecture, you can see that when we change the displacement by about 200 nanometers, we observe an unambiguous change in the voltage. So it is possible to create very complex form factors of piezoelectric materials and then to construct devices, utilize them in devices today. Now, there are a few biomedical applications that we have also explored. For example, it's possible to attach different chemical functionalities onto these nano-architected materials. And so this is Daryl, I believe he was just showing off. So he was creating all these different architectures and attaching all these different chemistries onto them. One of them is very useful. This is the so-called NBOC protector. So when you attach this group onto the surfaces of your materials, it's able to either protect it from reacting with other species or to open it up for a reaction with other species. And we had an interest in attaching DNA to these architectures, for example, to make a membrane. So when you create a membrane that allows for the red blood cells to flow and then attach a particular chemical functionality to it, it's able to adhere and to chemically react with, say, excess medication for chemotherapy in the body and then to wick it away. So this is a way to attach to drugs, for example, within a fluid flow. Now, another project that we were interested in was, can we now start thinking of these as active materials? For example, creating architected shape memory polymers, which can serve as very small stents or as stimulus responsive materials in response to temperature, for example. So this is the work of another former student in our group, Louisetta Elliott, who got her PhD in medical engineering just a few months ago. So she figured out a way to create these cross-linked polymer chains that have shape memory properties. What we mean by that is that you can take one of these cross-linked shapes and then deform them using mechanical means into a shape that you want, and then remove that mechanical load, and that shape will be preserved. Now, when you heat up the structure, it'll go back to the originally programmed shape. And so what she was able to show was that you can make mini stents, or micro stents rather, or something that will expand inside of your body. So this is a very pretty rendition of a flower, for example, with the petals opening up and closing simply in response to heat. So now imagine you can have a neural probe and you insert that into your brain, and you can change the stiffness and the configuration in response to the temperature, the warmer temperature of the body. So that was what we were interested in. Now, a very substantial pursuit in our group is in electrochemistry, and we're very interested in creating safer and lighter lithium-ion batteries. So what Daryl and another student in our group, Kai Narita, thank God he hasn't graduated yet, unlike all the other ones, set out to do is to make a battery that has an architected anode and cathode. And so what you're looking at here is the way to fabricate a complex oxide, lithium cobalt oxide. So it certainly has a particular architecture, as you can see here. So it's no longer a slurry electrode, which is very typical for these cathode materials. Now, combining that with a carbon anode, you can see that these scientists combine them into a coin cell. And so sure enough, we're getting a battery type of electrochemical response. And what you see here is the specific discharge capacity charging at different rates. So we can charge them very fast or charge them very slowly. And let's agree that this is not the world's best battery, but someday it will be. And apparently it was so neat that there are two journals that decided to feature each side, the anode and the cathode, on their covers. And so when you combine them together, it creates a full battery. I don't understand why they put the light bulb here instead of a Tesla, but that will be in our next set of papers. So speaking of electrochemical materials and batteries, and also the defects together, this is probably the last part I'd like to share with you. When we use these microarchitected materials as stimulus responsive materials, for example, in response to electrochemical stimulus, it's possible to design them such that each individual beam now has some active material in it, for example, silicon. Now, what my, yet again, former student, Xiaoxing Xia, who got his PhD in 2019 in material science, did is he created a microarchitected battery. And what you're looking at here is he's lithiating it. So this is a larger structure. And you can see that in response to lithiation, it's forming this very neat pattern. Now, I'm a musician, so to me, these look like violins, but to many of you, maybe they look like sinusoidal patterns. So here they are. I'm showing you these originally tetragonal straight beams as they're buckling into these curved sinusoidal type patterns. Now, this is its response to lithiation. So it turns out that when you start lithiating these materials, sometimes your nodes can counter rotate, and that leads to this kind of a bowed out buckling event. But sometimes they can co-rotate, in which case it leads to this very frustrated type of an architecture, which creates a boundary. And so that's what you see here, that some of them look like kind of like perfect domains, and some of them look like domain boundaries. So we collaborated with a Professor Claudio Duleo at Georgia Tech, who helped us explain using a model for why this would be occurring. And so this is what he computed, that as a function of lithium concentration that's dissolving and diffusing into these architectures, it's possible to elicit both of these shapes. Well, Xiaoxing looked at this and said, well, we take a flaw and call it a feature. So these are certainly defects, but we can use them to program with them. And so what I'd like to point out here is this. Xiaoxing made this micro-architected battery, and he programmed a pattern of defects into them. And you don't know about this pattern until we start lithiating this battery. So please watch very carefully. All we're doing is we're lithiating this battery, and we're watching the pattern that's emerging. And hopefully what you can see here is that the pattern that emerges here bears quite a bit of resemblance to my little logo that apparently I'm no longer allowed to use on the right here. So this is one way where external stimulus can be used to reconfigure and morph materials into different configurations. All right, so this brings me to the last part of the talk. So I guess the big question is, well, so what? You showed us a bunch of pretty pictures and maybe some of the videos were nice, but what's the big deal? Why should we care? And so this is the takeaway message. If you are clever about three very important parameters, one of them, of course, is the material architecture. And again, I'm just reminding, bringing back some of the architectures that I'd already shared with you, but they, of course, that parameter space is infinite. The second one is nanomaterials, and that is how your specific material responds to the reduction in size. Maybe it has size effects, maybe it doesn't, but how it exhibits the size effect is very important. And the third one is the atomic level microstructure. Is your material amorphous? Is it crystalline? Does it contain defects? These three are the key drivers for creating entirely new material classes with not only unprecedented properties, but with uncoupled properties that have always been linked together. And the reason why you would want to do that is so that in the future, we don't need to have hearing aids. Instead, we would be able to simply write the cochlea bone that can be inserted directly into your ear. And so you'll be able to hear again. So that our iPhone 83 will not need to be charged for more than maybe once a year or so, so that the balloons will no longer have to be filled with helium, because of course, as soon as we figure out how to make these materials not porous, they're going to be strong enough to withstand the vacuum. And of course, the vacuum is lighter than air, so we don't need to be using the precious resource of helium. For the holiday season, of course, the ornaments will never be shatterable again as we start making them out of these suppressed brittle failure materials. And this is probably my favorite example. So remember way back when we all gathered together, and usually at these types of lectures there would be desserts available. So here's some brownies that everybody likes. So our next company is going to be focused on chocolate nanolattices, which are 100% taste, 99.9% air, and 0.01% calories. So with that, I'd like to finish and of course, hugely acknowledge my group. I'm the one who gives these talks. And again, a few years ago, we used to travel and actually fly in the airplanes and deliver these talks. And I was fortunate enough to travel all over the world, but my students really are the ones who are making it all happen. So huge thanks to them. And of course, all the funding sources. And this is the end of my talk. And I welcome all of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia, for a really great talk. So I have a couple questions from our audience. So the first question is, additive manufacturing is currently processed oftentimes layer by layer. So this is time consuming, especially when small features are introduced. So what do you foresee as a path around this challenge?
Right. So the speed at which additive manufacturing is happening is certainly very, very slow. So I actually have a little bit of a backup slide here. We have to get away from this layer by layer type construction, or from what the 2-photon lithography technique does, which is where you expose voxel by voxel. What we have to figure out is a way to create a much larger field of an architected material in a single laser exposure. So what I'm showing you here is some of the technology that we've been developing in our group in collaboration with Professor Faraon's group in utilizing metasurface masks to develop an interference lithography based approach where we can create different patterns using interference lithography in a single laser pulse. So that's one approach. Another approach, of course, would be roll-to-roll processing, where maybe you would have a big array of lasers that are able to operate in parallel and create these patterns in a football field-sized roll-to-roll production plant. But it's the economy of scale, really, because all of these technologies are not only slow, but they're also very expensive. So the only way to make these materials commercializable is bringing them to a very, very large scales.
So the next question is, laser fluence can affect the amount of cross-linking polymerization. So how do you see this affecting the properties of solid materials, things like elastic modulus or refractive index?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So you really have to understand the effect of the laser power that you're using in your instrument to create your materials. Now, it doesn't matter so much if you're creating a sacrificial scaffold. So if you're writing something that's a scaffold and after it's written, you're going to deposit something else onto it and then etch it away, it probably doesn't matter very much. But if you're using this kind of chemical synthesis approach to create materials out of with different chemical functionalities, then you really have to understand the effect of laser power, and not only on the cross-linking in the original resin, but on the grain size formation, for example, or on the specific bonds that are formed after the exposure. So that is definitely a very important factor to consider when creating these materials.
So the next question is actually about a comparison between the carbon nanolattices and the other, like the hollow nanolattices. So the question is, why do the carbon nanolattices shatter instead of recover like the hollow?
Yeah, that's actually a terrific question. So here, let me show you some of the shatterable carbon nanolattices. So in the hollow nanolattices, they deform and they're able to recover by a process called shell buckling. And so this shell buckling allows, imagine your soda can. So it allows the material to spring back after corrugating it effectively. And that kind of instability is an elastic instability. And so that allows the elastic instability to fully recover to its original shape. In contrast to the carbon nanolattices, where the beams are not hollow, so they don't have that mechanism of recovery. In fact, the elastic buckling is not even available to them because there are so many defects like flaws, small microvoids and inclusions and stress concentrations that before your material ever has a chance to experience buckling as a structural response, the material itself fails at these local stress concentrations and where failure propagates fully. And this is exactly what you were seeing here. And this is exactly what we've been observing. Now, if we were to make hollow nanolattices using carbon thin ribbons effectively of nano-sized carbon and simply coat a scaffold and then etch it away, the same type of recoverability would still be possible.
Awesome. So there's a quick question about the ability to engineer these. So do they have the ability to be engineered in a biocompatible or hemocompatible way?
Yes, absolutely. But you know what? Before I answer this question, I actually want to show you this buckling, if it's okay. I would like to, let me stop sharing this one. And I'm going to share this one. I would like to point this out. So it turns out that the hollow architectures recover because, since you asked, you guys are going to have to endure some math here. So if you imagine a beam of having a particular thickness T and a radius of A, turns out that there's in fact this ratio, critical ratio of T over A that's unique for each different material that dictates that if your structure is your architecture is designed such that your T over A is below this critical ratio, it will buckle. It'll undergo a buckling elastic instability. But if it's above this ratio, then it will fail. And sure enough, this is what we're observing with the hollow architectures. So when the T over A of 0.016 is below that, you can see from the data, first of all, full recoverability. And you can see the post-deformation image here, which you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from before and after. Now, as you increase the wall thickness to 20 and further, such that to 20 nanometers and further, such that the T over A ratio approaches this critical ratio and exceeds it, you can see that the deformation becomes much more stochastic and much more jerky. And here, this particular one, I believe that's similar to the video that I showed, such that it fully doesn't recover. So that's the big difference, is the presence of the buckling mechanism. Okay, and sorry, Rebecca, you read the other question, which I no longer remember. Could you please say it again?
The other question, which I think I have, I think you answered all of the question that I had last time. So I'm going to actually ask a little bit of an additional question, which is, have you looked at these in different loading regimes or different loading rates? And if so, how does that affect the response?
Yeah, which ones though? The hollow one, I guess let's categorize them. Did you want to
Hollow, the hollow ones.
Yeah, the hollow ones, it doesn't appear to be dependent on the complexity of the stress state. And so this is what I tried to demonstrate here. So these stress states are very complex, as well as the geometries are very, very complex. They're inhomogeneous, and they appear to be not susceptible, at least their energy storage capacity doesn't seem to be a function of either the strain rate or the complexity of the stress state. It appears that the deformation of these materials is driven much more by the local distribution of stresses than by the globally applied stress. And so even though it's complex in the sense that the energy landscape of, or rather the stress landscape of the localized regions is very different between them, as long as it doesn't exceed the fracture strength, they will fully recover. And so that's what we're observing in the deformation of these hollow architectures. Now, these are made out of very brittle ceramics that typically are not known for strain rate effects. So this is alumina. So here there isn't much of a mechanism through which the strain rate would manifest itself. However, the metallic ones certainly would. There would be a different mechanical response at different temperatures, as well as at different strain rates.
Thank you. So kind of adding on to the mechanical behavior of these, there's a question about the fatigue response. So do you expect what do you expect in terms of the fatigue response, and particularly in a difference between tensile and compressive loading?
I can't imagine what motivated this question, given how many cycles were performed here. So we have not yet fully explored the fatigue regime, but what I can share with you is this. So this plot, oh, actually, I even have that here. Let me go to my property space here. Yeah. So this is how fatigue manifests itself. When you look at this material property space, what I plotted here are these guidelines for how the strength should scale with relative density for 3 different types of architectures. So what I'm showing you here is the so-called worst type of architectures, which is stochastic. So these are random architectures, like think of your yoga mat. And what that tells us is that as you reduce your density by a factor of 2, your strength falls off by a factor of 4. They have this square dependence, or 1/2 dependence. Then the so-called bending dominated architectures allow you to be a little more efficient, in the sense that the power now is 1.5. So as you reduce your density by a factor of 2, your strength will be less affected. Now, the best type of architectures are the so-called stretching dominated solids. And so here's this line. And in fact, that is exactly what the theoretical maximum here represents, is this linear scaling, right? So in the octet architecture, which is what I showed, when you reduce the density by a factor of 2, presumably your strength will fall off by a factor of 2. So the question was about fatigue. And so these are our earlier points. And please, if you can follow this dashed line, you can very clearly see that it's much worse than the theoretical maximum. It certainly is not linear. And so this is where the fatigue comes from. So even though they fully recover globally, there is still some damage initiation at the nodes. And so it is entirely possible, and we've actually observed it, that in some configurations, there are micro cracks and nano cracks that form at these nodes, and then they just open and close under fatigue loading conditions. So they don't affect the recovery, but they do deteriorate the strength. And this is why our strength here falls off at a higher rate than what is theoretically predicted. Of course, when you create these fractal type architectures, you can see that we've actually fixed the scaling to being linear, again, because of their effective load redistribution among the beam members. But that's one of the motivations for why we decided to explore nodeless architectures, which are the woven ones that I showed here. These are the architectures that don't contain any nodes. And the idea here is that they would be less susceptible to fatigue because they don't really have these strong stress concentrations of initiating damage.
Thank you. So there is a little bit of a technical question, which is, how are you defining the contact area for calculating the stress in these architectures?
Yes, absolutely. So utilize this global cross-sectional area. So the contact area is effectively a footprint of your nano-architected materials. We very much want to think of these materials as opposed to structures. So if you were to calculate the local stresses, of course, you have to take into account the load that is applied to each individual cross-sectional member. But looking at these globally from the material standpoint, we very much define it as the footprint area, and to calculate the global stress that's affecting the entire material.
Thank you. So I have a question here that's asking if you've measured any of the heat transfer properties in these structures.
We actually have investigated the heat transfer, or rather the thermal properties of these nano-architected materials in collaboration with Professor Austin Minich's group a few years ago. And we were able to show that you can, at the same stiffness that you would normally have tiles, for example, for the space shuttle, you could tune the thermal conductivity and the thermal properties in general of these materials such that they're decoupled from the modulus. So you could make something very, very lightweight and at the same time extremely thermally conductive or extremely thermally insulating. That has everything to do with the phonon mean free path in the specific material. And so the range of these materials is somewhat limited. So you can work with some oxides and you can work with some materials whose phonon path, mean free path is very well known, so that you can get below that mean free path. And so that is what allows you to modify and to affect their thermal properties.
Awesome. So I have a quick question here that is asking, your work is similar to a lot of bioceramics and properties seen in biomaterials. Do you have any comparisons, or do you look to biological models for your work?
We very much have. Let me start sharing a different screen here. Yes, in fact, many biomaterials have served as inspiration for some of the work that we're doing here. And in fact, we worked with bone quite a bit. Here we go. In our previous life. So here's the work of my former student, Dr. Ottman Tertulliano, who's worked directly with trabecular bone. So what he was able to uncover is the very hierarchical length scales within a particular biomaterial. Here, of course, this is trabecular bone, where you can show that there are regions that are ordered, regions that are disordered, and then through separation of scales in different materials like extracellular matrix versus hydroxyapatite, it's possible to discern their mechanical properties from each individual phase. And in fact, that project motivated quite a substantial effort in our group in trying to create biologically compatible scaffolds, so that we would create the scaffold that would mimic the real biomaterial and then populate cells onto them and study their tissue formation. And so what I'm showing you here is some of the work that Ottman did in terms of understanding fracture in bone. And so he was able to first of all identify the different phases that are present in bone, and then connect it to this fibril bridging mechanism. And so yes, and so this is what he uncovered. He was able to conduct these fracture experiments. So you can see here that this is a typical fracture experiment in this notched configuration. And when he was able to look at the fractured surface, what you see here is the clear fibrils being pulled out from the matrix. And so what our materials in fact draw inspiration in many ways from these hierarchical arrangements presented by nature, which of course has had millions of years of evolution in trying to design and optimize for some of the properties like suppression of brittle failure. So that was a very meaningful question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a question here, which is actually from some students in the audience. And so they were wondering when you first got interested in science. I know it's not quite about your talk, but I think it would be great if you could say a couple words about when did you first get interested in science?
I guess I would say that I got interested in science when I realized that my piano career wasn't going to generate a real salary. That's the silly answer. But the more serious answer is I had an incredible advisor in graduate school, Professor Bill Nix, who was such an incredible mentor and such a passionate teacher and just such an inspirational person that it was hard not to get addicted to science. We got a little bit lucky in making a pretty substantial discovery of the size effect that I shared with you that was that emerged in the nanomaterials when I was doing my PhD work. Of course, I was already in the PhD program, so you could say that wasn't truly the beginning, but it was truly a manifestation of my learning how science can be so inspiring that there's really no other way to live. So I couldn't imagine doing anything else for my career now. But at that time, it was really just having somebody who really believes in you. It's very important to have a mentor who supports you and really believes in you. And much earlier, when I was about 12, my dad made me solve a lot of math problems to earn a dog. So I guess that's where I had to start being technical.
That sounds like quite the start. So another question is there any new physics that we find from these structures, or are they all just kind of a scaled down version of macro theories?
Whoever asked this question, thank you for that, because that is exactly what we're thinking about now. We're thinking specifically along those terms. So first of all, there's definitely new physics. So the field of architecture materials is very much moving towards topological effects and topological insulators, for example. So looking at how the surface properties are very different from the internal properties, which we can't really call bulk properties so much anymore. But in general, the material surface properties tend to be different in terms of, for example, unterminated or terminated atomic bonds at the surface versus within inside the material. So there's quite a bit of new physics to be discovered simply by the virtue of such a tremendous surface area to volume ratio of these. Another area where new physics might emerge is with being able to create microstructures. This is atomic level processes that are far from equilibrium. And that is something that we're very interested in. Sure, we can form a metal using additive manufacturing or a ceramic or a glass or something like that. But can we use these processes of fully chemically derived metals or fully chemically derived glasses or ceramics such that we push kinetically their microstructure in the realm where it's metastable or where it's far from equilibrium? So I most certainly think that there's plenty of new physics to be uncovered. The question is, how do you detect it and what is the best way to probe it and what is it that you're probing for?
Awesome. So we have time for one last question. And this question is, what has been kind of the most unexpected response or finding in your work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat this question, please?
Yeah, what has been the most unexpected finding or
unexpected finding
response? Yeah.
I have a funny answer. The first one is going to be a funny answer. In the most unexpected aspect of this work was how many of my students want to work on batteries. I still kind of can't quite understand why there were so many people who came in who really wanted to work on batteries, but now I'm hooked too. I would say that everything that we've been working on so far has proved to be interesting. I don't know if it's expected or not, but it seems like this is the gift that keeps on giving, that almost anything that we try uncovers some kind of a new territory. And that just really is a testament for how much there is left to do. So be it on the synthesis side, where we didn't even know if we could create resins that contained other ions, or that they could be not just a photoinitiatable polymerization chemistry, but that we could add other functionalities. Can we influence the degree of cross-linking? Can we burn off these organics? Can we reduce the metal oxides to their parent metals? All of these questions, we didn't know the answers to these questions. We didn't know the mechanical response. We didn't know that they were going to recover. So it seems like there's so much left to be understood about these materials. And it's the combination of incredible perseverance of my students, of course you're one of them, and a little bit of my intuition, as well as having incredible experimental capabilities. And of course, some tremendous brain power here at Caltech and with my collaborators all over the world, that really allowed us to tackle some of these problems in very interdisciplinary ways. And so we are all learning from each other and almost inevitably uncovering and uncovering new phenomena and uncharting new territory.
That seems like a great place to end for the evening with some inspiring words. So thank you, Julia, for a tour de force exploration of your work in nano-architecture of materials. And thanks to everyone who attended this IDEAS lecture. Please check the IDEAS website, that's given in the chat window if you're interested, for future IDEAS lectures. And good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.